It was an ordinary afternoon when Jason stepped out of his house. The sky was clear, and the sun was warm, but there was something in the air that felt different, as if the world was holding its breath. He walked down the street, his footsteps echoing on the pavement. The neighborhood looked the same as always, the houses lined up perfectly, the lawns freshly mowed, but something in the distance caught his attention, a figure standing by the old oak tree. It wasn't anyone he recognized. It was a woman with dark hair dressed in a long coat. Though the weather was warm, she stood still as if waiting for something or someone. Jason slowed his pace, feeling an odd pull toward her. He couldn't explain it, but something about the way she stood there made his curiosity grow stronger. As he got closer, he noticed the woman's eyes. They were fixed on him, almost as if she had been expecting him. Her gaze was intense yet calm, her face expressionless, but there was a slight quiver in the air between them, like electricity hanging in the space. Jason stopped a few feet away from her, not sure if he should speak or just keep walking. The silence stretched on longer than it should have, but before he could say anything, she finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried an eerie weight to it. "You've been waiting for this moment, haven't you?" The words hung in the air for a moment. Jason's heart skipped a beat. How could she know what he was thinking? He had no idea who this woman was. He had never seen her before, but there was something about her that felt familiar, like she had been part of his life for longer than he could remember. It made him uneasy. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been waiting for something," she repeated. "A change, something to shift in your life, to break free from the routine you've been stuck in." Jason felt his breath catch in his throat. How could she know that he had been feeling restless for months now? Everything in his life felt stagnant, like he was walking in circles, always looking for something more, but never finding it. He had tried to ignore the feeling, tried to convince himself it was just a phase, but deep down he knew he was ready for something bigger than this life. The woman's lips curled into a small smile. "It's time for you to make a choice." "A choice?" Jason echoed. "What do you mean, what choice?" She stepped closer, her voice growing more urgent. "The choice to leave behind what you know, to step into the unknown, to take a risk that will change everything." Jason's mind raced. What was she talking about? He had a job, a home, a family. He couldn't just throw it all away, but at the same time, he couldn't deny the pull to do something more, to feel alive again. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "You will," she replied, her smile widening slightly. "But you must decide now, before it's too late." The words lingered in the air as the world around them seemed to slow. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear and excitement. But he knew one thing for sure: this moment would define everything that came after it. Jason stood frozen, his mind racing as the woman's words echoed in his head. She said he had to decide now, but decide what? The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and for the first time in a long time he felt like he was standing at the edge of something bigger than himself. He glanced at the woman again. Her expression remained calm, unbothered by the storm of thoughts that raged inside him. She seemed to know something he didn't, and that knowledge unsettled him. "What is it that you want from me?" Jason asked, his voice shaky. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced around as if making sure no one was watching them. Though the street was empty, the houses on either side stood silent, like they were part of the scene. In a play frozen in time, she stepped closer, until she was inches from him, her presence both comforting and intimidating at the same time. "It's not about what I want," she said softly. "It's about what you need." Jason furrowed his brow. What could she possibly know about his needs, about what he wanted from life, about the things that gnawed at his soul? In the quiet moments, when he was alone, he had always been careful never to voice those thoughts, never to admit to anyone, even himself, how empty things sometimes felt despite all the comforts he had. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice lower now. The woman tilted her head slightly, her eyes boring into his, as if she could see straight through him. She exhaled softly, as if what she was about to say was something he needed to hear, something that would make all of this make sense. "You've been living in the shadows, Jason, in the comfort of what you know, but there's more out there waiting for you, something you've been avoiding for a long time." She paused, and her gaze softened for just a moment. "Something that will change you forever." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. The way she spoke made it sound like a warning, but also an invitation, like he was being called to something bigger than himself. But he didn't know if he was ready for that. "How can I trust you?" he asked, his voice tight with doubt. The woman's lips curled into a small smile. "You can't trust me," she said. "But you can trust yourself, trust the part of you that has always known this was coming." She stepped back slightly, her eyes flicking to the road ahead before returning to his face. "Trust that part of you that is already asking the questions that you've been too afraid to answer." Jason swallowed hard. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had always known deep down that something was missing in his life, something was out of place. But he had buried it beneath the surface, hidden it behind the routines, the responsibilities, the distractions that kept him going from day to day. But now those things felt like chains holding him back from something greater. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them once more. But this time it wasn't uncomfortable, it was charged, as if the air itself was waiting for him to make his move. "You're ready," the woman said, her voice steady and knowing. "Now it's up to you to take the first step." The weight of her words pressed down on him, and Jason felt a sudden clarity wash over him. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know what choice he was supposed to make. But he knew one thing for certain: the moment had arrived, and he couldn't go back. Jason's mind raced faster than he could follow the thoughts that spun in every direction. He wanted to say something, but the words caught in his throat, as if they were trapped behind the weight of the moment. What was he supposed to do now? The woman was still standing in front of him, waiting expectantly, like she knew the decision had to come from him. But he had no idea where to even start. He glanced down the street. The houses still looked normal, the world still felt the same, but somehow everything was different. The ordinary had become strange, and the strange had become overwhelming. His heart hammered in his chest. He could feel it like a ticking clock in his ears, each beat reminding him that time was running out. He opened his mouth again to speak, but only silence came out. There were no answers. There was no guide he could follow. It was like being on the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss, not knowing if he would fall or if there was something there to catch him. The woman didn't move. She just watched him with those steady eyes, like she knew he was searching for a way out, searching for a reason to stay in the comfort of his old life. But he knew deep down he couldn't stay in the same place forever. There was something calling to him from beyond the edge of everything. He knew a pull he couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore either. It felt like a part of him had already stepped forward, while the rest of him remained frozen in time. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the weight of his thoughts. Was he ready for this decision? Was he ready to step into whatever awaited on the other side of the unknown? The truth was he had never felt ready for anything in his life. Not like this, but the nagging feeling in his chest wouldn't go away. It kept pulling him forward, urging him to make a choice. The woman stepped back a little, her presence still overwhelming, but less pressing now. It was as if she had given him the space to breathe, to think, to decide. But Jason couldn't think anymore. The choice wasn't something he could reason through. It wasn't something that made sense in the logical way. He was used to thinking it was something deeper than that, something his soul already knew, but his mind was still trying to catch up with. "Do you want to stay here?" The woman's voice broke the silence like a whisper against his skin. "Do you want to keep walking the same path, or do you want to step into something greater than what you've known?" The question hung in the air like an ultimatum, but it wasn't a threat, it wasn't forceful. It was an invitation to leave behind the life that had kept him safe, but small invitation to walk into the unknown and trust that it would lead him somewhere better, or maybe somewhere entirely different. Jason's chest tightened as he looked at her. He couldn't explain it, but he knew the choice was his, and the moment was slipping away. He glanced one last time at the street, the houses, the familiar world he had always known, and in that instant something shifted inside him, like a door opening in his mind. He wasn't ready, but he was never going to be ready. The time to decide was now. "All right," he whispered, barely audible, but the words were there. The choice was made, and there was no turning back now. Jason felt a sudden shift as the words left his mouth. The moment he said them, he knew it was too late to turn back now. The woman smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of understanding, like she knew exactly what he had just realized, like she had seen this moment play out 100 times before. Yet there was something reassuring in her gaze, something that calmed the storm inside him. just a little good choice," she said quietly, as if affirming his decision, but Jason didn't feel calm. Not really. His heart was still racing, the weight of the decision still pressed on him like an invisible hand. But there was also a spark of excitement. Something deep within him told him he was doing the right thing, even if he didn't know what the right thing actually was. She turned slowly and began to walk away, her footsteps light against the pavement. Jason stood still, watching her, but not following, yet something in him urged him to move, to take the next step, to do what he had agreed to do. "Where are we going?" he asked, before he could stop himself, his voice a little louder than before, but still uncertain. The woman didn't look back. She simply continued walking, as if she had expected the question, as if it had already been answered in the unspoken understanding between them. "We're going where you need to go," she said, her voice steady but distant. Jason stood there for a moment longer, watching her retreating figure. He knew he couldn't let her walk away without making the next move, without stepping into the unknown himself. He didn't know what awaited him, but he knew staying here would never give him the answers he sought, so he started walking after her, his feet moving almost instinctively. It was as if the decision had already been made for him, long before he ever spoke the words. The street was empty, the houses still silent, but everything felt different, somehow more alive, as if the world was watching him, taking notice of the choice he had just made. The sun was lowered in the sky, now casting long shadows across the road. The air had a faint chill to it, but Jason hardly noticed. He was too focused on the figure ahead of him, the woman who seemed to know everything and nothing at all. She moved with purpose and grace, as if this path was already laid out for her, but Jason had no idea where it would lead. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, though the sun was still setting slowly. The neighborhood was far behind them, now the houses replaced by trees and open fields that stretched out endlessly on either side. Jason's feet ached from walking, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had chosen this path, and there was no turning back. Finally, the woman stopped in front of a large stone archway that Jason hadn't noticed until they were standing directly in front of it. It was covered in ivy, the stones weathered and ancient, but there was something about it that drew him in, like it was calling to him. "This is where it begins," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he looked up at the archway. The world suddenly felt smaller, and the weight of the decision he had made hit him again. This was at the moment where everything changed, but for the first time since he had spoken those words he felt ready, even though he didn't know what awaited him on the other side. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice trembling, but filled with a new sense of purpose. The woman nodded and stepped aside. "You've already made the choice, now it's time to walk through." Jason took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. But this time it was different. It wasn't fear, it was anticipation. The unknown was no longer something to fear, it was something to embrace. And with that thought he stepped forward into whatever came next. Jason stepped forward, his heart pounding. As he moved toward the archway, the moment his foot crossed the threshold, he felt the world shift beneath him. The ground trembled slightly, as if he had just broken the surface of something deep and vast. Ahead of him was nothing but darkness. But not the kind of darkness that felt threatening. It was different. It was welcoming, almost like a space that had been waiting just for him. The air was thick with the scent of something unfamiliar, but strangely comforting, a mix of earth and something else he couldn't quite place. But it didn't matter, because at that moment he knew he had made the right choice. The woman had already passed through the archway before him. Without a sound, she was now standing a few steps ahead, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light that stretched from the other side. She turned to look at him and gave him a small nod, as if confirming that he was indeed supposed to be here, that he had done the right thing. Jason glanced back over his shoulder at the world he had just left behind, the neighborhood, the houses, the streets that had been his entire reality. For as long as he could remember, now seemed far away, almost unreal, like a distant memory he couldn't hold on to anymore. He felt no urge to go back, though, just the opposite. He felt a strange sense of freedom, almost as if he had been tethered to something before, and now the rope had finally been cut. "Where are we going?" he asked again, his voice barely a whisper in the stillness of this new place. The woman didn't answer immediately. She just motioned for him to follow, And he did without hesitation. The ground underfoot was soft now, almost like walking on a bed of moss. The world around him was a mixture of shadows and faint glowing lights that seemed to pulse with life every step he took. The further they went, the more the sense of familiarity grew stronger. It wasn't a place he had ever been, yet it felt like he had always known it, like a dream he had forgotten but now was slowly remembering. They continued walking through the darkness, the woman ahead of him guiding him through the strange path that twisted and turned in ways he couldn't quite follow at first. The only sounds were their footsteps and the occasional whisper of wind that stirred the air, but soon Jason began to notice other sounds that didn't belong to the world. He knew they were soft at first, like the distant hum of something alive, something ancient. But as they walked further, the sounds grew louder, like the earth itself was speaking to him. He opened his mouth to ask her what these sounds were, but the words never came out, because in that moment he saw it ahead, a faint glow at first, no more than a flicker in the distance. But it grew brighter with every step he took until it was a glowing portal that hovered in mid-air, casting strange shadows on the ground. It was like nothing Jason had ever seen before, but there was something about it that felt familiar, something about it that made him feel like he was on the cusp of discovering something far beyond anything he had ever known. The woman stopped and turned to face him. She said nothing, but her eyes spoke volumes. They were filled with something Jason couldn't name, but he could feel it in his chest, something that made him want to step forward and walk through the light, something that told him this was the moment that everything would change. "This is it," she said, her voice low and calm. Jason nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was ready. He didn't have a choice, though, did he? The choice had already been made, and now he was standing on the edge of something far greater than himself. He took a deep breath and stepped forward toward the light, not knowing what awaited him on the other side, but knowing for the first time in his life that he was ready to face it. Jason stepped into the light, his body tingling as he crossed the threshold. The moment his feet touched the other side, he felt a wave of warmth wash over him. It was like stepping into a world where everything was alive. Every leaf, every stone, every breath of air had its own rhythm, its own heartbeat. The air smelled sweet like the first rain after a long drought, and the ground beneath his feet felt solid yet soft, as if the earth itself was welcoming him home. He looked around, taking in the vastness of the place. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The landscape stretched out in all directions, a sea of green with towering trees that seemed to reach the sky, their trunks twisted and ancient, their leaves shimmering with an otherworldly glow. The sky above was a deep purple with streaks of gold cutting through it like rays of sunlight breaking through a storm. It felt surreal, but somehow familiar. It was like a dream Jason couldn't fully grasp, but he knew he was meant to be here. He turned to look behind him, but the archway was gone. There was no trace of the path they had walked, no sign of the world he had just left. It was as if he had crossed into another realm entirely, one that existed separate from the life he had known for so long. He felt a flicker of panic, but it was quickly replaced by a strange calmness, like he had always been meant to be here, and everything that had come before was just the beginning of a much larger story. The woman stood beside him now, her figure just as sharp and clear as the world around them. She was silent for a moment, as if letting the reality of this new place settle in before speaking. "This is where you will find what you've been searching for," she said, her voice still soft, but with an edge of certainty. Jason swallowed his nerves. The feeling of being completely lost in this new place was overwhelming, yet there was something inside him urging him to keep moving forward, urging him to trust this moment, trust that whatever this was, it had a purpose. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to find or what was waiting for him, but he knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. He looked at her again, feeling a mix of fear and awe. "What do I do now?" he asked. She smiled, but there was no pity in it, only understanding. "You wait," she replied. "You wait for the answer to come to you." Jason furrowed his brow. What did she mean, wait? He didn't understand. There was nothing here to wait for. Everything felt alive, everything felt like it was moving. But there was no clear direction, no map to follow, only the landscape stretching endlessly in front of him. "Wait for what?" he pressed. "You will know," she said. "You will feel it when the time is right." And with that she turned and began walking away, her steps light and purposeful. Jason stood there for a moment, watching her go. He wanted to follow, But something held him back, something told him he needed to stay right where he was, to let the silence settle around him, to let the place speak to him on its own terms. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the strange air around him, the hum of life beneath the surface of everything. It was all around him. He could feel it thrumming in his veins like the pulse of the earth itself. And as he stood there waiting, he realized something important. He wasn't lost. He was exactly where he needed to be. Jason stood still for what felt like hours, his body attuned to the rhythms of this strange new world around him. The trees whispered softly in the wind, their leaves swaying gently with each breeze that passed, like the world itself was breathing in and out with him. He could hear distant sounds like the calls of animals or creatures he couldn't see, but the air was thick with life and the energy of everything that existed in this place, as if the very earth itself was alive and aware of his presence. He didn't know how much time had passed since the woman walked away, but he felt no urge to move, no desire to rush forward. It was as though the place had given him permission to simply exist for a moment, to be fully present in the here. And now he closed his eyes and listened, letting the sounds wash over him. The quiet hum of the world seemed to fill him in a way nothing had before. It was like being enveloped in a cocoon of calm, and knowing everything around him was in perfect balance. Even the strange purple sky above him seemed to hum with energy. When he opened his eyes again, he saw something moving in the distance. At first, it was a blur, just a flicker of movement between the trees, but as he focused, he saw the figure of a person emerging from the shadows. It was a man, tall, with dark hair, wearing clothes that looked nothing like anything Jason had seen before. They were simple yet somehow intricate robes of dark green and gold that shimmered in the fading light. The man walked with purpose, his movements graceful, like he was at home in this place, as if it belonged to him. He didn't approach right away, but instead stopped a few feet away and studied Jason with a curious but neutral gaze. Jason felt the weight of his eyes, but didn't feel threatened. There was something calm about him, something reassuring, despite the unfamiliarity of his presence. The man spoke at last, his voice soft but clear. "You've come," he said, as if it were an inevitability. Jason blinked, unsure how to respond. He had no idea who this person was or why they were speaking to him, but there was something in his voice, something in the way he said it, that made Jason feel like he wasn't being judged or questioned, but welcomed. "Yes," Jason said, unsure of what else to say. The man nodded slowly, as though that answer was exactly what he expected. "You are ready," he said simply. "Ready for what?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled, a faint expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You'll find that out in time," he said, "but for now you must follow me." Jason hesitated for a moment, still unsure of what was happening, but the man's presence was calming, like he was a guide to something greater, something Jason couldn't yet understand, but could sense deep inside him that it was important. He couldn't explain it, but the pull to follow was undeniable, and so he nodded slowly and took the first step toward him. As he walked, the man led him through the dense forest, the path winding through trees that towered above them. The sounds of the forest grew louder with every step, as if the place was alive and aware of his movements. They moved in silence for a while, but Jason felt no fear, only a sense of wonder as they walked deeper into the unknown. The world around them seemed to change as they moved further away from the place where Jason had first arrived. The trees grew thicker, and the air grew warmer with a strange golden glow that filled the space ahead them. He couldn't help but feel like they were walking towards something important, something that would change everything he thought he knew about the world he lived in. The man stopped suddenly and turned to face him. "We are almost there," he said with a serious look in his eyes. Jason's heart began to race, but he wasn't scared now. He was ready. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it. They walked for what felt like hours, the air thickening with the strange glow that bathed everything in its warm embrace. Jason could feel his pulse quicken with each step, but it wasn't fear this time. It was anticipation, like he was on the verge of discovering something monumental, something that would finally make sense of everything that had led him here. The man ahead moved with such ease, like he belonged in this place, like he was part of it. Jason couldn't help but feel like an outsider, even though something inside him told him he wasn't, but he couldn't put it into words. It was like his soul recognized the place, even if his mind didn't. The path ahead began to clear as they moved deeper into the heart of the forest. The trees became more spaced out, and the ground more even beneath their feet. Ahead of them stood a massive stone structure, a temple of sorts. Though it looked ancient, the stones were worn with age and covered in moss, yet it radiated power, something ancient and timeless. It stood in stark contrast to the vibrant surroundings, as though it had always been there waiting for them. The man stopped in front of the entrance and turned to face Jason, his gaze steady and unyielding. "This is where your journey truly begins," he said, his voice softer now, almost reverent. Jason nodded, though part of him still didn't fully understand what that meant. He had known from the beginning that there was something important waiting for him, but what he was supposed to do once he reached it remained a mystery to him. He could feel the weight of the man's gaze on him, urging him forward. "What happens inside?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile stillness that surrounded them. The man didn't answer right away. He only motioned for Jason to follow him into the temple. Jason hesitated for a moment, looking back at the forest, the path they had taken, and then at the temple that loomed before him, its massive stone walls casting long shadows on the ground. He didn't know what awaited him inside, but he felt like he had no choice but to go forward now. He was too deep into this journey to turn back. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the temple. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the air shifted. It felt colder here, and the quietness of the place was almost suffocating. The walls were covered in strange symbols etched into the stone, like ancient writings Jason couldn't understand, but somehow felt he should know. The light that had bathed the outside world was dim here, as if the space itself absorbed it, leaving only a faint glow that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. They moved through the temple silently, the air growing heavier with each step. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as they walked deeper into the heart of the structure. It was as though the temple was alive, breathing with him. With every movement he made, the silence was oppressive, but not threatening. It was waiting, as if the temple itself was waiting for him to do something, to make a decision. They came to a large chamber. At the center of the temple, the walls curved inward, creating a circle around them. In the center of the room stood a pedestal with a single object resting on it. It was small, but powerful, radiating an energy that Jason could feel even from a distance. His heart skipped a beat as he stepped closer to it. It was a stone of sorts, but unlike any stone he had ever seen before. Its surface shimmered in a way that felt almost unnatural. It pulsed with light in time with his heartbeat, and Jason couldn't look away. The man stepped behind him, his voice low and serious. "This is what you came for," he said. Jason's breath caught in his throat. As he reached out to touch the stone, he could feel its warmth against his skin as he made contact with it, and the moment his fingers brushed the surface, something inside him snapped. Something deep within him unlocked, and the world around him seemed to explode into 1,000 pieces. The moment his fingers touched the stone, Jason felt a surge of energy, unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was as though his mind and soul were being pulled in 1,000 different directions. He could feel the power of the stone coursing through him, his body trembling with the intensity of it. His breath caught in his throat as he struggled to make sense of the overwhelming force that was flooding his senses. It felt like everything he had ever known was being rewritten in that instant, like his very existence was being remade from the inside out. He tried to pull his hand away, but the stone seemed to hold him there, its energy binding him to it. He felt his heartbeat race and his chest tighten, as if the power within it was too much for him to contain. His mind spun with visions, flashes of places he had never seen, of people he didn't recognize, of moments that seemed impossibly distant yet somehow intimately familiar. It was like he was seeing all of time unfold before him, like he was part of something much bigger than himself, something ancient and boundless. The man's voice cut through the haze of Jason's thoughts, his words soft but clear. "Do not fight it," he said. "Let it come, let the knowledge and the power flow through you. It is meant for you." Jason's mind screamed for him to stop, but there was something inside him, something deep and primal, that knew he couldn't let go of this moment, that he couldn't walk away from what was happening. He had come this far, and now there was no turning back. The visions grew stronger, the flashes of images growing more vivid, more intense. He saw the world as it once was, and as it could be. He saw battles fought in ancient lands, and peaceful moments shared in faraway places. He saw the faces of people who looked like they could be family, though he had never met them. He saw the rise and fall of civilizations, and the echoes of their triumphs and their failures. It was as though he was connected to everything, every soul, every moment that had ever existed. With each passing second, the weight of the knowledge grew heavier, and Jason felt himself becoming lost in it, his mind swirling with the infinite possibilities of what the stone had unlocked within him. His hands gripped the pedestal, desperately trying to steady himself. But it was no use. He felt like he was drowning in the flood of images and emotions that poured over him. Suddenly, the images stopped. The rush of power came to a halt, and Jason was left standing in the center of the chamber, breathless, his body trembling, his heart still racing, as if the storm inside him had finally quieted. But the world around him had not returned to its normal state. The air was still thick with energy, and Jason knew deep down that he was different now. He wasn't the same person who had walked into the temple moments ago. He had been changed irrevocably by whatever force the stone had unleashed within him. He looked at the man who was standing silently behind him, his expression unreadable. "What happens now?" Jason asked, his voice hoarse, as if he had been shouting for hours. The man studied him for a long moment before speaking, his voice calm and certain. "Now you will begin your journey. You will use the power you have gained to shape the world around you, to fulfill the purpose for which you were called." Jason's mind reeled with the weight of those words. What purpose? What was he supposed to do with the power he had just unlocked? How was he supposed to use it? "You are not alone in this," the man added. "Others have walked this path before you, and others will follow after you, but the choices you make will be yours and yours alone." Jason took a deep breath, the reality of what had just happened beginning to settle in. He had no idea what the future held or what his role in all of this was, but one thing was certain: whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it. Jason stood still, his body still trembling from the surge of energy that had just coursed through him. The world around him seemed to pulse with an unfamiliar rhythm, like the entire temple was alive with expectation. He felt a weight in his chest, a pressure that he couldn't explain, but somehow knew it was tied to what he had just experienced. The stone had unlocked something deep within him, something powerful and raw. But the implications of it all were still beyond his understanding. The man's words echoed in his mind now: "You will begin your journey." But what journey? What was he meant to do with the power he now carried? How was he supposed to shape the world? As the man had said, he had no answers, only a sense of urgency deep within him. Something was calling him forward, something was pulling him into a future that seemed both exhilarating and terrifying at once. He glanced at the pedestal one last time. The stone now dimmed, its glow faded, as though it had completed its task, its power transferred to him now. It was just an ordinary object resting in the center of the room. The hum of the temple grew quieter, as if it was waiting for him to make the next move. The man moved to the side of the room and gestured toward the exit. "You have everything you need now," he said, his voice steady, but there was something in his eyes that told Jason this was the final step. The man wasn't going to guide him anymore. From here on out, he was on his own. Jason swallowed his uncertainty. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. He wasn't sure where he was supposed to go next, or what exactly he was supposed to do, but he could feel the weight of his decisions ahead pressing on him like a burden. And yet there was a strange sense of clarity that came with it, a sense that for the first time in his life, he wasn't wandering aimlessly. He was following a path that had always been his to walk. He nodded slowly to the man who had brought him here to this moment, and then turned toward the exit. The massive stone doors creaked open as he approached, revealing the forest outside. The glow from the temple still cast a faint light over the trees, but everything else seemed darker now, as if the world had shifted in the wake of what had happened within those walls. As he stepped out into the open air, the breeze brushed against his skin. It felt lighter now, somehow more connected to him than it had before. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while felt a sense of purpose, not knowing exactly where the road ahead would lead, but knowing he was ready to face whatever came his way. He began walking the path ahead of him, not sure of his destination, but certain that with every step he took he was moving closer to understanding the truth of who he was meant to be. The power that had awakened inside him was no longer just a distant force, it was part of him now, and he could feel it coursing through his veins, urging him forward. The man's voice called from behind him, "Remember, you are not alone, others walk this path as well, but the choices you make will be your own." Jason turned for a brief moment to look back at the temple, its ancient stones standing proud against the darkening sky, and with that final glance he understood that he was ready to begin the journey, his true journey, the one that had been waiting for him all along.